Okay, so today we are moving in to talk about our final piece of Unit 2, 2.6, Behavioral Genetics. This one is going to go a little bit in depth. I'm going to do what I can to keep it as easily understandable as possible, but it is a wildly complex topic. We're probably just scratching the surface of this. If you've taken probably AP Bio, something like that, this will be very straightforward, but for a lot of you, this can probably a bit confusing. So stick with me, use the textbook if you need that. But as a whole, know that in class we'll do what we can to go over these things again and go in to answer any of the questions that you have. So while you're watching, prepare questions that you can ask when we get into class. So 2.6 behavioral genetics, and a lot in the field of psychology that we're trying to do is do this predict differences between people and how much of that can be based on genetics. Because remember, the big question we're trying to ask, this focus here, is how much of the difference between people is between nature and how much is it between nurture, right? That was what we started this year with, and it's what a lot of we do all year is, right? Is trying to figure out that difference. How much is nature? How much is nurture? And the differences between people. Remember, psychology is the study of human thought processes and behaviors, and we're trying to ultimately figure out why we do what we do. And understanding genes is a big portion of that. So as we get into this idea of behavioral genetics, we're ultimately studying the differences and trying to weigh the differences or weigh the effects of heredity or our genetics and our environment. So nature and nurture. So we'll be looking at our genes, right? The segments of DNA ultimately found within chromosomes. We have around 20 to 25,000 of these total. And one of the things that you have to know for psychology is that each one of these is ultimately either active or inactive, so expressed or inexpressed. So what that means is that nature gives us that set of DNA. And then ultimately, nurture is what kind of activates or sometimes inactivates, deactivates some of those genes. So our environmental factors have a genetic impact. Right? And this is kind of a recent discovery in the last several decades that our genes are actually impacted by our environment. And so we have to recognize that it's not just nature, it's nature being impacted by nurture, nature being impacted by our environment. So when we are trying to study that, we're looking at that human genome, like all of our genes combined. And so what we found, this is the mid to late 90s, I think, was that almost all of our genes are the same, right? All humans share 99.9% genome is identical, right? Is the same. We have this shared genetic profile. We have common ancestors. Natural selection has kind of weaned us down to ultimately all being the same, right? So when people try to argue that there are racial differences, right, like a lot of this just comes down to melanin, right? Like the difference in the way we look, but not really the difference in what we are, right? We are ultimately very much the same. So these behavioral geneticists, what we're looking at here is trying to tell the genetic variations and then figuring out how much that can describe our behaviors and thought processes. Again, when it comes to psychology, that's what we're looking for. So the big way that they do this are these twin studies, and ideally, when possible, adoption studies. Ethics is a big question here, as it always is in psych studies. And oftentimes we're leaning on studies before ethics became as big of a consideration, but still, when possible, if twins are split up for some reason, they are oftentimes chosen for studies, as that is such valuable information and data. Because again, when we're setting up studies, the big thing that we're trying to do is control. Right? We're trying to control for as many factors as we can. And the only way that we can control for genetics is with identical or monozygotic twins. They have literally the same genes. They start with exactly the same slate. And so the only thing that can account for their differences is their environment. Right? And so if we have them in different environments, then we can really figure out how much of the difference between them is accountable to that. So this kind of lays that out there also. Control home environment, and it helps us study heredity. And if we control the heredity, then we can study the home environment. So difference between those identical and fraternal identical twins, also known as monozygotic twins, meaning there is just one egg. Right? You've got one egg that then splits. These will always be the same sex. These have identical genetics at birth. Right? The same egg splits in two. Right. I guess I can't say identical genetics at birth. There are some more recent theories that there can be epigenetic changes within the uterus or within that can result in very small differences at birth. But for the most part, they start with exactly the same site at conception. They are the same genetic structure. So what we find over the course of their lives is that environment shapes those genes, right? And yeah, so this is what I was saying there. So the placenta or nutrients that they get can shift their genes at birth. And then fraternal twins are basically just siblings, right? They are different eggs, different sperm. So they are born at the same time, but the only thing you have controlled there is environment, right? Their genes are just as different as any other set of siblings. And so in studying these, right, in studying identical and fraternal twins, a meta-analysis, remember looking at lots and lots of studies to try to come up with a big idea, found that identical twins are much more likely to behave similarly and share personalities than fraternal twins. And that is regardless and controlling for how parents treated them. Okay, so regardless of their interaction with their parents, identical twins are more likely to behave similarly and share personality than fraternal twins. And there are lots of studies that do this. Probably most famously, the Minnesota twin study between 1979 and 1999 looked at 81 pairs of identical twins and 56 pairs of fraternal twins. And when we're looking at identical twins, they were of course, identical twins oftentimes are the more valuable portion of the study. When we're looking at genetic environment or genetic influences, we can look at the difference between identical twins who were raised separately in two different households and the monozygotic twins who were raised together in the same household. Okay, all of this twin study, for the most part, was done with twins who were put up for adoption. So monozygotic twins raised separately in different households or together. And what they found, right, when we're controlling for environment in this case, and when they're raised together and then raised separately, in which they're in drastically different environments, what they found was that in a lot of these cases, they still came out almost the same, right? So for instance, Raven Intelligence Test, which is a nonverbal intelligence test, it looks at fluid intelligence. It'll use matrices and kind of logic problems with shapes. Their scores were the same, right? Like monozygotic apart and monozygotic raised together. So twins raised together or apart, their scores were almost completely identical, right? There was no difference whatsoever. Now, when you look at the WACE IQ test, which is much more of a verbal IQ test, there was a decent difference. Now, to be fair, they were still almost 80% similar. That's really, really similar, right? Now, while that's still kind of different, that's still very, very similar. So they even in different environments, their IQ, both verbal and nonverbal, is pretty similar. So other things we saw, like brainwave, blood pressure, and heart rate, almost identical. Blood pressure, a slight difference, still 91% similar. We see personality, most interesting, almost identical, right? Almost always personality between identical twins, we see almost the same, right? So things like extroversion or introversion, things like aggressiveness, aggression, patience, like temperament, a lot of those are going to be very, very genetically influenced and not so much by environment. So extremely striking similarities for those, no matter if they were raised together or apart, in what they preferred, what they wanted to do, what they liked, their abilities and attitudes, their interests, things they were afraid of, no matter their environment. Probably the most striking case of this were the famous couple of the Jims, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer, who are both part of the Minnesota twin study, separated at 4 weeks. They were adopted into different families. They met when they were 40, right? So 40 years later, they met and discovered that they had both been married twice, first to a woman named Linda and then to a woman named Betty, right? They had named their son the same thing, James Allen Lewis and James Allen Springer. They both had the same name of a dog named Toy. And they also behaviorally had tension headaches. They were both nail biters. They both vacationed at the same beach. They drove the exact same car, right? And they smoked the same brand of cigarettes. So all kinds of crazy similarities. Famously, also, if you've seen the Three Identical Strangers, there's a documentary. I think it's on Hulu right now. It's the same story basically about triplets who had the same experience. They discovered that they were triplets when they were about 20 years old, and they had basically the same thing. They all had the same preferences in women, in their cars they drove, in the cigarettes they smoked, in their interests in life, in their different biological issues. Like they, as a whole, like wildly similar. So genetics, what we see from this, plays a really, really big role. When people have the same genes, they turn out pretty similarly. And in separated twins, in another study that was entirely focused on that in Sweden, they found that identical twins together and identical twins apart had, compared to identical twins reared together, separated identical twins had slightly less similar personalities. So the findings weren't like exactly as strong as this like 1979 twin study, but still showed that they were still relatively similar. Right? And especially when they looked at identical. Right? Identical twins were very, very similar. However, what they found was that certain things are influenced by adopted parents, like our attitudes, our values, religion, our manners, how we interact with others is often very driven by our environment. But things like our personalities are much more related to our biological parents. We looked at it within these adoption studies. They looked at the difference between twins who were adopted by or were raised by their biological parents, and then those who were raised by adoptive parents. And they looked at those with the adoptive parents and compared them between the two. And they found that the adopted child was much more like their biological parents than they were like their adoptive parents. Final thing to talk about is molecular genetics when we're getting into looking at not just the genome or all of the genetics together, but what specific genes influence behavior, trying to find the genes that work together that influence our basically who we are, things like our body weight, things like our sexual orientation, our introversion or extroversion. And it's not as simple as saying like, that's the introversion extroversion gene. It's lots of these things that work together. And this oftentimes can seem kind of sci-fi tech scary, like we could have these designer babies. But the idea, right, the idea is that we would be able to recognize and diagnose and possibly fix with things like CRISPR, things like depression, schizophrenia, learning disabilities, alcohol and drug use, pretension. So like all kinds of things that are kind of built into our genetics that we could possibly modify either in womb or in early stages of our life that would then like kind of eradicate a lot of these issues. And ethically, of course, this gets into the issue of we return to the issue of what you want to do with your pregnancy. We think about like how ethical is it for you to tell a parent like, hey, it seems like your child is going to have a small reading disability, or people knowing things about their kid and how much like placebo effect that may have about going forward. How much is too much to know about the future genetic code of your child before birth? Final, and this can be a confusing topic, I know, is this idea of heritability. So a couple things you really have to know, because people struggle with this every year. Heritability is this, and it's nothing beyond that, right? So don't try to read too far into this. Heritability is the extent to which the variation among individuals can be attributed to our genes. Okay, so this is not how much of you is made up of in our genes versus this. Like, so think of heritability kind of as a nature versus nurture score, but it applies to groups. It does not apply to individuals. Okay, so idea here is that our genetic influence or our genes explains the percentage of the variation among people in groups. Okay, so some of the more famous ones, IQ is one of the most studied, and the heritability score for IQ is 50%, right? Meaning that the difference among a group of students, so if we looked at the students of AP psychology, right, the difference in your all's IQ scores, the heritability score would be 50%, meaning that the differences between you all in IQ, ranging from probably like 100 to 140 something, the difference in your all's IQs, half of that difference can be accounted to your genetics, and then half of it can be accounted to the environment, right? This breaks down, and it doesn't work as well when you're doing it at the individual level. You cannot apply it and say, well, half of my genes, half of my IQ comes from my intelligence, or comes from my nature, and half of it comes from my nurture, right? Half comes from genes, half comes from environment. It doesn't really work that way. It's about the difference. Heritability is a score that shows the difference between people, how much of the difference between you and someone else can be ascribed to heritability. It can only be studied in larger groups. You can't really say heritability is the difference between you and one other person. It's about the heritability between you compared to a larger group. Okay, so the difference amongst the group that comes down to environment versus how much it comes down to genetics. So we're looking at this on the left here, right? This like plant, this soil bed here, where all of the nutrients are controlled for, and it has a normal selection of nutrients. So it's a pretty good place to grow. The uniform lighting, so they all get the same amount of light, they all get healthy soil, and you're still going to see a difference between these plants. Some are very tall, some are very small, and there's a range. The score of this, right? The score of this is going to be a heritability of 100%, right? Because all of the difference amongst these is controlled by their genes or their genetics, right? The difference between this really tall plant and the smaller plant comes down to genes. It cannot come down to environment because look, they've all got the same lighting. They've all got the same soil. They all got the same amount of water. So the only thing that can account for the difference between these is their genetics. Right? That's going to be that case. And a big idea that you should probably recognize, you often see a question about, is recognizing that heritability score increases, right, as the environment becomes similar and better, right? As in a really, really good environment, the difference between people is very much going to be heritable. So the difference between, for instance, siblings, if we're looking at just siblings, the heritability score is going to be much higher. Right, between you and all of your siblings, the heritability score is going to be pretty high because, yes, you have kind of similar genes, but your environment's going to be pretty dang similar. So it's going to be much more likely that the difference between you is genetic. And that ultimately all comes down to this idea of this gene-environment interaction, in which nature and nurture aren't so much separate, but they're interacting with each other. And what this is causing, and what you really need to recognize here, is this term epigenetics, meaning nature kind of turns on certain portions of our genes. There's a lot of our genes that are inactive, right, that are just sitting there waiting to be triggered. Probably most well-known things like breast cancer gene or genes for Alzheimer's. Those are there, right? They're within our genes, and some people are born with a specific portion of their genetic code that inclines them to be more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer or Alzheimer's. And it takes some form of interaction with our environment to trigger that, right? There are people that have that gene and it never comes to fruition, but when nurture triggers that, that leads to, right, breast cancer or Alzheimer's. And there's lots of different things that this happens for, right? A lot of this is going to happen within the womb, but much of this happens once we're outside as well. And so epigenetics is this idea that our nurture impacts who we are, right, in our nature. So that is that for this one. This is for genetics. Genes versus our nature versus nurture. I know this is a long and kind of confusing one. Develop some questions, prepare them, come to class with them. We will see what you still want to know. So until next time.